being considerate and compassionate toward other people. So I'll just tell you what happened. It was in 1968 at the gathering of the rabbis, and at the end of this marvelous evening, my father and Dr. King were going to speak privately, but my father took me over, and I was just a kid, a nobody. And he took me over, and I had met Dr. King a few times. My father said, "Do you remember Susie?" And I thought, why would he remember me? I'm a nobody. And Dr. King, who must have been exhausted at the end of a long day, 11 o'clock at night, he said, "Of course I remember Susie." And I thought that was such a wonderful gift that he gave me, that despite being exhausted and wanting to just relax at that point, that he gave me that attention. And so nowadays, and sometimes when my kids or my husband or my students get on my nerves, I remember Dr. King. And I try in those moments to turn my heart around. Yeah. So I'm grateful for so many of the things, so intellectually, spiritually, but even in these small ways with other human beings, he showed us how to be a mensch, how to be a good person.
Well, and Bernice, you followed in his footsteps. You became a minister yourself. You followed the path of faith.
Yeah, I don't describe it that way because it took me 8 years to answer the call into ministry. I struggled for many reasons. I was 17. I didn't see any, women actively in ministry at the time, particularly in my tradition, the Baptist church. There was one woman, but she was 40-something years old, that was a licensed minister in our church because my granddaddy was pretty progressive. I was a teenager and wanted to keep being a teenager. I was drinking at the time. I didn't want to stop drinking. And I saw this, seriousness and responsibility that came with being, not to suggest that, all drinking is bad, but for me, the perception at the time was, especially the kind of drinking I was doing, that, someone in that role and responsibility, would not be doing that kind of drinking. And then as time passed from 17, going to Spelman, ultimately to Emory, Candler School of Theology, I started thinking about my own personal identity. I did not want to be always labeled as the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr. I wanted my own identity. I wanted to know who I am. I wanted to forge my own path, have my own voice, and be comfortable with that. So it took me 8 years before I finally answered the call. And then I refused to do any deep study or reading or listening to my father. Because what I didn't want to become is a junior female Martin Luther King Jr. And yet, when I did my first message in 1988 on the eve of my 25th birthday, after it was over, my mom said, "Do you remember listening to your father or seeing your father?" I said, "No." She said, "You have his gestures." I'm like, oh, God. I was like, wow, intonations and gestures. He used to do just like that as well. And then Uncle Andy, who's Ambassador Young, mentioned to my mother that he asked the same question. Has she studied her father? Because, she has some of those same intonations, and he was crying the entire time of my message. So I said all that to say I ran from the whole essence of my family and this King aura because it was so overwhelming. And what really helped me become who I am today is really credited more so to my mother. My mother really, gave me comfort and peace when she said, "You don't have to be your father, you don't have to be me, but just be your best self." And anytime, people look for whatever that is, because sometimes I feel people are looking for another Martin Luther King and there'll never, ever, 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 ever be another Martin Luther King Jr. I hear those words of my mom. My mom helped me to better understand who my father was. Martin Luther King, that we know today and that is revered as an icon, would not have been were it not for my mom. I mean, he was one of the most hated men in America when he was assassinated. And now he's one of the most loved men in the world because she spent all of her life after his assassination being the architect of the King legacy, and helping us to understand his important teachings, especially his nonviolent philosophy and methodology. And so she talked a lot about that growing up, and she didn't just talk it, she lived it. I mean, when my mother would say, "I don't hold grudges," that's not something she was just saying and being contradictory and doing something else. I literally saw her engage people who she felt hurt her, and just like my father, that heart of unconditional love that she had, an incredible ability to forgive and be generous and kind and gracious. Those things, inspired me, and really, I think perhaps it was more so embedded in me when she passed. I really felt on her passing a tremendous responsibility to know and understand my father fully, because the person who for years had been the face of that legacy was her. And I realized and recognized that in order for his legacy and what he represented to continue into future generations, I had to step up to the plate. And I had to be in a position to now even become a bridge for generations who didn't know him. And because I had, 5 years in the generation when he lived, and so I see myself as a generational bridge, sometimes as a bridge between faith communities, as a bridge overall. So ultimately, yes, he's inspired much of the way that I think, but it came through my mother.
And Susanna, for you, your father, outside of the Jewish community perhaps, is not as well known as Bernice's father. Do you feel any responsibility towards his legacy?
I certainly do. And I've edited a couple of books of his articles, and I often speak about him and lecture to different kinds of groups. What I find is that the people that I meet, such as Ambassador Young, people who knew him in the civil rights movement, are to this day grateful and happy and appreciative. And I'm really moved by that they saw that they had an ally, and they were grateful to have an ally. And I think it's a lesson for us today. Sometimes people come to us and say, I want to be your ally in this struggle. It's not my community or my struggle, but I want to be your ally. And I think we should embrace that. And there may be some differences. It's sort of like a tight muscle, and you have to kind of massage it a little bit and work it out. But yes, I think what we're learning from their friendship is the importance of alliances and the remarkable ability of people from very different worlds to come together. What brought them together were their principles and their beliefs and their Bible and God. And there's a saying of a Hasidic Rebbe from the 19th century, the Kutzker Rebbe. Somebody came to him and said, "Where is God?" And he said, "God is everywhere, but everywhere that you let God in." So perhaps we need to let God in and let in our allies as well and work together.
everyone here knows that in the past few years there has been an alarming upswing in overt racism and anti-Semitism, both in this country and around the world. And I can only think that both of your fathers would be so saddened by that, but they would want us to fight it. And so how do we respond in this time to this racism, to this anti-Semitism, to this hatred?
Well, one of the things that we've been doing at the King Centers called Beloved Community Talks, we can never do too much of that. It's essential and necessary. And I'm not talking about surface talk. I'm talking about elephant in the room kind of conversations. And we bring together divergent perspectives. I think many times when we have looked at confronting racism in America, we've done it in these silos, and we've done it with people in echo chambers, with people who think like us. And the only way, like what Daryl did, is we're going to have some courageous engagements with people who don't think like us, who may have racist notion and ideas, because I believe that most people who are racist, number one, most of them are not what I call purely evil. I believe there are some purely evil people in the world. I just believe that. That can be probably challenged. But for the most part, I think most people have been socialized, they've been taught, and some people are territorial, there's fear. And so my father said men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. And they don't communicate with each other because they're separated from each other. And so it's necessary, particularly now, that we not continue to polarize and divide because I don't agree with you. If there's one thing that you say or some policy that you have, I just cut off the relationship. I think that's dangerous. I think we still have to engage. I think we still have to believe and have hope. I think we still have to seek to understand before being understood. I think we still have to work on listening to each other. And it's a hard thing to do. It's not easy. But it's necessary and essential, because in order to find what we teach in nonviolence, what we call Nonviolence 365, which is Kingian nonviolence, we have to find win-win avenues and solutions and come up with win-win policies, because we will never all get along, we will never think alike, we'll never all like each other, but we do have to live and coexist together. And so I think that's one of the ways that we do that, and helps to raise some of the consciousness and helps us to begin to see where are these inherent and implicit biases that we each have.